waiting. We're waiting.
Look at her go, man.
Look at her.
In December of 2021, Courtney Hadwin sat down for a podcast interview and got asked a simple question. Who's your record label these days? She couldn't answer. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. The girl who once had the biggest golden buzzer moment in America's Got Talent history didn't know if she was allowed to say who represented her anymore. That's not what burnout looks like. That's not what quitting looks like either. Something had happened behind the scenes, something bigger than one teenager's career, and almost nobody watching her viral videos ever found out what it actually was. Here's what really happened to Courtney Hadwin, and where she actually landed. The night a shy kid stopped being shy. Courtney Ann Hadwin was born on July 6, 2004, in Hartlepool, County Durham, in the northeast of England. She grew up in Hesleden, a small former mining village with one school, one shop, one pub, and a working men's club, and not much else. The kind of place where everyone tends to know everyone else's business, whether they want to or not. Her mother once described it plainly. If you wanted to actually do anything, you had to leave the village entirely. And that meant early trips to nearby towns just to find a proper stage to practice on. Courtney has two younger siblings, a sister named Melissa and a brother named Paul. And according to her father, she'd been musical since the age of 5, well before anyone outside the family had any reason to notice. By her early teens, she was already busking on the street corners of her own village to pay for private vocal lessons, working with a coach named Julie Miles, who would later help her prepare for auditions on both sides of the Atlantic. She trained at several other local programs too, a theater school, a series of master classes, a small music academy, piecing together an education in performance that no single institution actually provided on its own, funded almost entirely out of loose change collected from passers-by. Her musical influences ran unusually deep for someone her age, pulling from Little Richard, James Brown, and Mick Jagger, rather than the pop acts most of her actual peers were listening to, a taste that made a lot more sense once audiences finally heard what her voice actually sounded like. Competitions came next. In 2015, she entered a local contest called Teen Star in Newcastle, singing a version of Bob Dylan's Make You Feel My Love. She didn't win. She didn't need to. A cover of Say Something started making rounds locally, and suddenly she couldn't walk down her own school corridor without someone stopping her to say how good it was. An odd kind of attention for a kid who was still, by every account, genuinely shy off stage. The following year, she picked up a regional performance award recognizing the best act to come out of Hartlepool that year, and made the finals of another talent showcase soon after, quietly stacking up credentials most people her age never bothered chasing in the first place. In 2017, she auditioned for The Voice Kids UK, turning coach Danny Jones's chair with a cover of Tina Turner's Nutbush City Limits, one of only a handful of contestants that season to earn a chair turn on the very first note. She made it through the battle rounds against two other young singers, Ebony Green and Holly Fermin, advanced through the semifinals with a James Brown number, and reached the final before elimination, performing a torch song from the musical Dreamgirls in front of a national audience that had no idea what she'd go on to do the following year. That same year, she opened for the group Sister Sledge in front of 18,000 people at a UK festival, a scale of performance most 15-year-olds never experience even once. A shy village kid was quietly building a resume most adult performers never manage in a full career. None of it prepared anyone for what happened the following year, on a stage 3,000 miles from home. The 60 seconds that changed everything. 13 years old, standing in front of the America's Got Talent panel in 2018, Courtney opened her mouth to sing Otis Redding's Hard to Handle. What came out didn't match the nervous kid standing there a second earlier. She screamed, she stomped, she moved like she'd been performing arenas for 20 years. channeling something that looked almost nothing like the polite, controlled performances the show usually produces from young contestants. Backstage footage later revealed just how anxious she'd actually been in the minutes before walking out, nervous enough that producers reportedly worried whether she'd manage to perform at all. The crowd was on its feet before the first chorus even landed, and the judges sat there visibly stunned by the gap between who was standing on stage and what was actually coming out of her. Howie Mandel didn't wait. He hit his golden buzzer, sending her straight to the live shows and skipping her past rounds. Most contestants have to grind through for weeks, and honor each judge and the host only get to use once per season. The clip exploded online, eventually racking up hundreds of millions of views across platforms, one of the most watched audition moments in the show's history. Judges compared her stage presence and her gravel-edged voice to Janis Joplin, a comparison that would follow her for years afterward, sometimes as a compliment and sometimes as a weight she never asked to carry. Even fellow judge Simon Cowell, not known for handing out easy praise, later told Howie directly that the pick was so good the two of them should consider starting a record label together. A half-joking comment that turned out to be more prophetic than either of them probably realized at the time. She kept climbing. Week after week, she reinterpreted rock and soul classics. Steppenwolf for one round, James Brown for another, Tina Turner for a third, building a run that showed range far beyond the single viral clip that had made her famous in the first place. By the finale, the shy girl who used to busk for lesson money was performing for a national television audience against a professional magician for the season's top prize. She didn't win. Shin Lim took the trophy that night. What Courtney walked away with instead would end up mattering a lot more, and almost nobody realized it at the time. One detail confused a lot of UK viewers at the time. Courtney was British, and there was already a British version of this exact competition, Britain's Got Talent, filming in her own country, closer to home and far less of a logistical undertaking for a family with two other children still to raise. Why fly to America instead of auditioning down the road? She answered that question directly in an interview years later, explaining that she wanted the biggest stage in the world, the one where most of her actual musical idols had come from in the first place. Her family backed the decision fully, later saying they always believed American audiences would connect with her in a way the UK crowd hadn't quite managed yet, and the numbers eventually proved them right. The deal that seemed like the real prize. Losing the final didn't slow anything down. Courtney's season 13 performances became the most watched of the entire season, buzzer or no buzzer, and by December of 2018, she'd signed a record deal with Simon Cowell's Psycho Music, distributed through Arista Records in the United States, a deal that industry observers at the time described as effectively equivalent to winning the whole competition minus the actual cash prize. For a 15-year-old from a village with one shop and one pub, this was the kind of deal that was supposed to change everything permanently. The exact outcome the entire AGT machine is built to produce, the payoff that makes years of busking on street corners feel worth it in a single afternoon of signatures. In 2019, she released her first project, a covers collection called The Cover Sessions, tackling songs by Harry Styles, Lil Nas X, and Lewis Capaldi, a way of demonstrating range before committing to original material and letting the label test which direction resonated most with her growing fan base. A holiday single followed in 2020, an original called Happy Xmas, The War Is Over, one of her earliest attempts at writing rather than reinterpreting someone else's song. She toured briefly with Shin Lim in Las Vegas, playing 5 live shows at a major casino resort as part of the prize package that came with reaching the AGT finale, and returned for America's Got Talent Champions the following year, performing an original song called Pretty Little Thing for the first time on that stage and finishing in 3rd place among former winners and fan favorites from earlier seasons. Everything on paper still pointed toward a major label trajectory. Build the covers, build the audience, launch the original material, watch it climb the charts, the way every talent show graduate has promised it will, with a team of professionals steering every release toward maximum exposure. Then, the releases just stopped. No third project, no album announcement, no label statement explaining why. Fans noticed the silence long before anyone explained it, and for years, most of them assumed the explanation had to be personal. Well, it wasn't. The label that vanished before she did. Here's what actually happened, and it has almost nothing to do with Courtney herself. In July of 2020, Simon Cowell restructured his entire business, buying back Sony's stake in his television company while letting Sony keep full control of Syco Music, the actual record label that had signed Courtney less than 2 years earlier. It was a deal built around protecting his television brands, America's Got Talent and Britain's Got Talent among them, not around the roster of young singers his music label had spent years developing. And the fine print of who kept which asset barely made headlines outside the trade press at the time. 2 months later, in September of 2020, Syco Music quietly stopped operating altogether. Its managing director left the company. Its senior staff were redeployed elsewhere inside Sony or simply walked away to other labels. The label that had signed Courtney Hadwin less than 2 years earlier had ceased to exist as a functioning company, right in the middle of a global pandemic that had already shut down touring and studio work across the entire industry. Courtney wasn't an isolated case either. Other artists who'd been signed to Syco during the same stretch of years had already grown frustrated with the label before its collapse. And once the label folded entirely, most of its remaining acts either got quietly absorbed into other Sony divisions or found themselves effectively unrepresented overnight, with no clear path forward and no one left at the company who'd actually signed them in the first place. A 15-year-old singer doesn't get a press release when that happens. She just watches her own label go quiet around her, month after month, with nobody left to greenlight a follow-up album or explain what her contract even meant anymore. No meetings scheduled, no calls returned, just silence from an office that had effectively stopped existing while the rest of the world assumed everything behind the scenes was running normally. That's the real reason behind the podcast interview where she couldn't say who represented her. It wasn't secrecy, and it wasn't her choosing to be cagey with a host who'd clearly become a friend over the years. It was confusion, sitting inside a business collapse that had nothing to do with her talent and everything to do with corporate restructuring she had zero control over. The mystery fans spent years speculating about wasn't a mystery at all. It was paperwork, sitting unresolved at a label that no longer had anyone left to answer for it, rebuilding without a safety net. What Courtney did next says more about her than anything she performed on television. Instead of waiting for a new major label to swoop in and rescue the situation, she started building her own path, slower and quieter than anything AGT ever showed audiences, working without the promotional machine that had carried her through her teenage years. She began releasing music independently. Breakable, That Girl Don't Live Here, Call Me Back, Monsters, one single at a time, without a label machine pushing them onto radio playlists or securing television placements the way Syco once could have. She partnered with producer Kevin Bowe, based out of Minneapolis, and started shaping a sound that leaned further into rock and blues than the pop-adjacent covers her old label had steered her toward during those first 2 years. She's been open about the anxiety that came with the whole experience, the pressure of being labeled the next Janis Joplin before she'd even finished growing up. A comparison that flatters an audience far more than it helps a teenager figure out her own artistic identity. That anxiety wasn't only about the label collapse either. Years earlier, after her run on The Voice Kids UK, some of her own peers had turned on her at school, mocking her singing style and her stage presence to her face in a way that had nothing to do with any camera being on. Her grandfather later described the reaction as genuinely cruel, and Courtney herself has talked about being singled out and called names by classmates who weren't used to hearing someone her age perform the way she did. Most of the harsher treatment after her AGT run moved online instead, into comment sections and messages from strangers rather than face-to-face confrontation. which came with its own quieter kind of damage. Rather than chase the Joplin comparison or let any of that noise define her, she spent years quietly writing, developing, and figuring out what her actual voice sounded like without a network's editing team shaping the narrative around her, without a golden buzzer moment to lean on for momentum. None of this happened in public the way her AGT run did. There were no viral clips of the process, no golden buzzer moment marking the turning point, no standing ovations from a studio audience cheering her on. Just steady, unglamorous work. The kind that never trends, but occasionally adds up to something real. Built one unheralded single release at a time over the course of several quiet years. Where she actually is, right now. In September of 2025, Courtney released Little Miss Jagged, her debut full-length album, through independent distribution rather than a major label. Available on vinyl and limited edition digipack formats for fans who'd waited years for something beyond a handful of scattered singles. The title itself nods back to her AGT persona, the little girl with the jagged, untamed voice. Except this time, the songs were entirely her own, rather than covers chosen to showcase range for a television panel. Written and shaped across years of independent work, most fans never saw happening in real time. Music outlets covering the release called it a confident, honest fusion of rock, soul, and pop, the sound of an artist who'd finally found her own footing after a label collapse that once threatened to end her career before it properly started. Early in 2026, she followed it with a new single called Changes, a track built around exactly the kind of personal transformation her own story has actually been about. Alongside official music videos and behind-the-scenes footage posted directly to her own channels, rather than filtered through a label's marketing department. She's currently in her low 20s, touring across the UK and select venues in the United States, with well over 1 million followers keeping up with her online across Instagram and TikTok combined. She's not filling arenas the way a major label rollout might have manufactured with radio pushes and television tie-ins. She's doing something arguably more durable, building an audience that shows up for the music itself, rather than the memory of one viral audition from 2018, streaming her songs on their own merits, rather than out of nostalgia for a reality show moment. Her YouTube channel, running quietly since she first launched it years earlier, now carries official videos and behind-the-scenes footage that never needed a network's approval to exist, racking up tens of millions of views entirely on her own terms. Reviewers who've covered the new album describe her voice as having matured into something rougher and more lived-in than the polished 13-year-old belting Otis Redding on a game show stage, exactly the kind of natural evolution a label collapse and years of independent work were always going to produce, whether anyone was watching closely enough to notice or not. Monthly streaming numbers on platforms like Spotify put her firmly in the territory of a working, self-sustaining artist rather than a one-hit viral memory. The kind of quiet, compounding growth that rarely trends but tends to actually last. So here's the actual answer to the question fans have been asking for years. Courtney Hadwin didn't disappear, and she didn't fall apart under pressure. Her label did. She spent the years afterward doing the unglamorous work of rebuilding a career from a legal and corporate mess she didn't create, absorbing bullying at school and online hostility that had nothing to do with talent, and coming out the other side anyway, on a timeline that had nothing to do with anyone else's schedule but her own. What she came out with is exactly what the golden buzzer moment always promised, but never actually guaranteed on its own. A real, sustainable artistic identity, built on her own terms instead of a network's, with an album and a touring schedule to prove it, rather than just a viral clip from a talent show most casual fans stopped watching years ago. The girl who once couldn't say who her own record label was, now runs the whole operation herself. One single, one album, one tour date at a time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.